Hello, hello. Welcome back to Ladies in the Law, where we talk about the intricacies of being a female attorney in a heavy male-dominated field. And we talk about how to curate an authentic brand and just have a lot of fun together. My name is Allison Melendez.
And I'm Michaela.
And today's episode is going to be a little fun. And we're going to be talking about demand letters and how you can effectively use your demand letters to then incorporate that into your mediation brief. So let's start off. What is a demand letter, Michaela?
Yeah. So a demand letter is where we kind of dictate our entire case in one little nice form, nice little package. And so it's where you're demanding either the policy limits of the at-fault driver or the opposing side. You're demanding their policy limits, or you're demanding some kind of number within their policy limit range for that case.
And when does a demand usually take place?
So there are kind of a couple different times that it could take place. One time it could take place is pre-litigation. So before you're even filing a lawsuit, you might send a policy limits demand just, as an effort to maybe not have to file a case. And so you would send that before a lawsuit has even been filed, which would be the pre-litigation. And then beyond that, usually we'll be sending one kind of after we've started engaging in discovery so that we can kind of know what we're working with in terms of what the policy range is for the other side.
And then do you have to do a demand letter? Is that something that's required in every case?
No, it's not required in every case, but it's definitely a good idea to do.
Yeah.
Just because I think at the end of the day, like we're all trying to do what's best for each side. Like each side is going to be advocating for their client. And I think a good way of kind of communicating like, hey, this is how we value this case, I think is a really good starting point for each side to kind of be talking about where they align, where there's vast differences in the way that they see the value of the case. And then you can kind of start working towards hopefully a resolution, or you can see, okay, we're so far apart that we should start kind of gearing this up for trial.
Yeah. So I think focusing in on the pre-litigation stage. So before a lawsuit's been filed, can you explain maybe let's go through the headers. Like what are you including in a demand letter? Because I think everyone approaches it differently. And some people use boilerplate templates. Some people have very narrow and specific demand letters. What do you do and what like sort of headings do you include?
Yeah. So I definitely have a template for what I use, but I definitely more so have a template in terms of the format of it, not the content, because I think it's so important for each demand to be specific to that client. I think you do a disservice if you're just kind of, throwing whatever sounds good. It's like, no, I'm advocating for this specific client. And so I want it to be tailored to them and to the injuries that they've sustained and to the losses that they have because of it. And so the different headers that I have, so you start with an introduction, and that's essentially saying what the incident is. So if it's a motor vehicle crash, then I'll say on this date, this crash happened, this is how this crash happened, and kind of just give like a little narration of like what the incident is. Then my second section will be liability. So I'll explain, since we're plaintiff, I'll explain why we believe the other side is at fault. And so there I usually will cite like a California vehicle code, which sometimes you can find from the traffic collision report if it is a crash, or if it's premise liability, then you talk about the duty owed to patrons if it's like a company or, so there you talk about the liability. Then the next section I have is medical treatment. So essentially like all of the medical treatment that our client has gone through. I vary on like how detail oriented, if I'm talking about like every single appointment, or if I'm kind of just like summarizing chiropractic care.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
So for the medical treatment, are you pulling very specific language from the medical records, or do you just generalize and say like neck injury with complaints into the upper extremities? How specific are you getting for when you're serving this on the opposing side?
Yeah, for me, I pretty much like anything that they have been diagnosed with, I will put what those diagnoses are. But then I do take the time to explain how that manifests in that specific client. So if it is, radiating into upper extremity, I'll explain what the client has told the doctor in terms of like, I'll look at, the very first paragraph of like a medical record is like what that client went in talking about. And so I'll explain that like they feel tingling in their fingertips, or, I'll explain what that means specifically for that client.
And then do you do like a timeline of every single, all the medical treatment to date?
I do. But sometimes like if they've gone to one doctor and say there are like 5 visits, and every one of those visits, you got the same diagnoses, you got the same, complaints each time, I will say from this date range to this date range, and then kind of like summarize that for that date range. So I'm not, putting a paragraph that's just redundant.
Yeah.
And so I'll do it that way a lot of the time, but I'm definitely always, putting in like when any kind of like imaging was done. So MRIs or X-rays or CTs, I will definitely always put those in. Those aren't ones that I really summarize.
Injections,
exactly.
things like that. When I was on the defense, the demand letter was super, super helpful. Let's say I would get, when I was on the defense, I'd get the case 150 days before trial. And so my first time seeing the case, just to wrap my head around all the medical treatment, I would pull up correspondences or prior demand letters. And it was so helpful when it was broken out in a timeline.
Yeah.
And I could just go through so that I would have a cursory understanding of all the treatment to date. And then of course I'd go through all the medical records, but it's so, so helpful when it's just laid out clearly, like liabilities there, all the medical treatment, and then future treatment. So,
yes. And I think also like we touched about this on another episode where like you spend time going through your client's medical history.
Yeah.
And so like you kind of create your own little timeline for that case. Like, do you find that helps when you're doing demands? Because you kind of already have a little roadmap.
It's super helpful. The only thing is I still have to go back to the medical records because my summary is like annotated format versus I want the exact language from the medical records, but it's super helpful because I know exactly if there are gaps in treatment, like I need to understand why there were gaps.
Yes.
Did the client move? Did they start going to another physician? So I think for me, it really helps because coming from the defense, that's the first thing we look at. It would be, were there gaps in treatment? Were there any inconsistent complaints? Like on one record, they're talking about left-sided complaints, and then all of a sudden it switches to the right. And so I think all of that medical treatment timeline that I use, I incorporate into the demand letter, and I just try to make it very like simple for the defense to just like, okay, understand all the treatment. These were the injections. These were the visits with, their PCP or whatever it may be. So after the medical treatment section, what do you have?
So after the medical treatment section, it goes into the medical billing.
Okay.
So then I'll have a little chart. On the left-hand side is where the provider is and the facility, and then the right-hand side will be the total amount of bills. And then at the end, I'll just add that up and say like, to date, this amount of money has been, billed for the treatment that they have.
And then do you have a section for like future treatment?
Yes, I do. So anytime I'm going through the medical records, so when I'm doing a demand, that is my deepest dive of the medical records because I want to make sure I have everything in a good grasp on where they are to date. And a lot of the time in medical records, the very last section will be like recommendations or next steps. And so anytime I'm seeing something that's like, we recommend 3 injections, or we recommend this surgery if these injections aren't successful or do not help, or any kind of thing that's like this is the next step, I will incorporate that into a future treatment section. And so in there I'll be like, I will specify like this doctor at this facility on this date recommended X. And then I'll say these typically range from this price range to this price range. And then if there's like a couple of those, I'll make another chart where it's like, this is what could be in the future, because it's just like in your face. If it's one, I'll kind of just bold it in the paragraph.
I love that. So you have all your medical treatment, the future treatment, the bills, potential future medical costs, and then what's after that?
My favorite section, which is the non-economic damages. And so the non-economic damages is my favorite in terms of just like, it's one of the best opportunities to humanize your client. You get to really dive into how they have changed as a person beyond their medical records. I think when it comes to the case, you have the medical records that the other side has. They have discovery. Everything that they have has kind of just been like written. And I think that I always look at the non-economic damages section as an opportunity to put a face to the name, put a face to this incident, put a face to the pain that this person is experiencing. And so this section, I spend a lot of time going over with our clients. And I kind of just talk to them like, how has your life changed? Like, I know it's really incredibly difficult to sit here and talk about the ways that you feel you are different.
Yeah.
So I really try and do that in a couple sessions or kind of just throughout the case in general. But that's where I'll really talk about like a client who used to run marathons and loved running marathons and has all of these medals and amazing things that they've won, who just got in a car crash and now has, you know, a cervical fusion and is in too much pain to run. You know, like that is something that is like powerful to read. And so like I'll put pictures of the medals, you know, and be like, these are medals that they won pre-incident. Post-incident, they're struggling to get back into it. If that's their truth, you know, then I'll put that. And I think that gives a really good picture of who someone is beyond what their medical records might show.
Yeah, I think I take a similar approach and I over include. And I know there's a difference of opinion. Some people say, you know, why are you giving all this information up freely? Like that should be pulled in the deposition or whatever it may be. But I think for me, it's a demand letter can be so powerful if you really do tell a story through that demand letter. And if it's just boilerplate, like it looks like every other demand letter, it's just going to be ignored and it's not going to be really taken into account. And sometimes that extra, the time that you take really pulling that from the client and establishing their new normal, because at a certain point, like maybe they've plateaued and their treatment, they're getting by, but they're not going to get any better. And it's unfortunate, but there are cases like that. And I think establishing their new normal helps, because then later on in their deposition, you've already had these conversations. And so when you're preparing your client, they know what information to talk about and really explain. So I love that.
Definitely. And I like just making this person a human. Like they're not just another client.
Yeah.
You know, and I think while there are like so many approaches, I think like being able to like give the other side this information. So it's like, no, like this is also why we're valuing this case at this level.
Yeah. I think it makes you stand out a little bit too, because it makes you appear very prepared. Like you've spent so much time with your client. You really know their story. And then also, if you have an opportunity, we kind of touched on this in another episode, but if you have the opportunity to meet with your client in their home before you send out a demand letter and get pictures of some of these things like medals, it's so much more powerful.
Absolutely. I think home visits are something that like we always make sure that we get done. And what that means is just going into your client's home, you know, going into the place that they feel safest and most comfortable being vulnerable and open. And so I think when you do that home visit, it really helps going into writing a demand or going into any kind of like discovery when you're sending pictures. Like if you get to go into their space, it's huge in terms of like getting them to open up and truly like let you in.
I love that. And I think just practically speaking, you're not always able to do that. So sometimes maybe you have to get the demand out and you're just speaking with the client on the phone and you haven't had the opportunity to get these amazing photos. But at a certain point, like, well, maybe let me take a few steps back. So a demand can take place in pre-litigation, which is what we're talking about now. But do you also then sometimes issue them during litigation?
Yes, definitely. I think a lot of the times we do it kind of after discovery has started, because it's like, hey, like you have all of this information now. Like I'm going to, again, show you where we're valuing this case, why we're valuing this case at this level, and give you another opportunity to really like look at it. And I think this kind of goes into what you were saying with a home visit. So if you don't have an opportunity to do a home visit, something that I really like to do is when I'm talking to my client and I'm getting them to just kind of talk to me about, you know, like, oh yeah, I used to run marathons. I'm taking notes of like, did they ever read, you know, have a training program? Did they win medals? Do they have their, you know, like the little like sign when you run? And so I'm doing that so that I can then follow up and be like, do you have pictures of XYZ? You know, so it's not necessarily me having to take those pictures, but maybe like, if you have it, can you send me a picture of it?
Yes. And especially if your client has moved. I know sometimes I have a client that had a motor vehicle crash in California, but then ended up moving to a different state. It's so helpful if they had photos before, because by the time they moved, who knows where everything is.
It's like literally my favorite part of moving is just like the I don't need this anymore. I didn't use this. And you just like shed.
So we've talked about, well, did we cover all of the headings within the demand letter?
The very last one would be the demand itself.
Oh, the most important part.
But it is kind of just like the very last one. So it's the demand. So if it's a policy limits demand, you're going to just say like, we're demanding, for all of the reasons above, we're demanding your policy limits. If it's a specific number, we'll say that. And then we give a date for them to respond by.
How much time typically?
Typically 30 days.
Okay. And are you including copies of all the medical records attached with the demand?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I do. Every single medical record that we have to date. And something that I didn't talk about either, and this isn't in every single one of the demands that you do, but a lot of the times it can be, is prior treatment.
Yeah.
Or prior injury or any kind of prior. A lot of the times I like to include that in the demand because it's like, I'm not trying to hide this.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not trying to just skip by this. Like, maybe they did injure their back 10 years ago, but they hadn't treated in 5 years before this incident. And so I kind of put that there like, yeah, no, we know this exists. And also this is why it's not that important.
Yeah. It's so powerful because then you have everything you need to evaluate the claim. And it's frustrating because I think sometimes we send these comprehensive demand letters with hundreds of pages of medical records and photos and everything that we think the opposing side needs to evaluate the case. And then, they'll hit you with a response that's like, we have insufficient information. And it's like, all right, time to file a lawsuit.
But yes, I do attach the medical records. Yeah. And then if there are priors, I will attach those as well.
Okay. So walk us through. So we just talked about a demand letter pre-litigation. Now, let's say for whatever reason that demand was rejected or the opposing side needed additional time to consider more information. Let's go through. So we've already done a couple segments on discovery. So let's just assume that the case is now in discovery. You've gone through written discovery. You've gone through depositions. You've gone through a defense medical exam. At what point do you then reissue a demand letter?
It would probably be definitely before mediation.
Okay.
Or if mediation is scheduled for like 4 months down the road, I'll send it just to be like, hey, just a reminder, this is where we're at. But I like to do it after discovery so that we kind of have a definite, form interrogatory 4.1 is when the other side tells you their insurance and their policy limits. And so like once we kind of have that too, I think that is good. And I guess this will depend on each case, but is your demand now increasing because you are in litigation? Depends on if it's an open policy. Okay. And so open policy will happen when the other side, they have had the opportunity to have all of this information. You've already sent a demand. And if they unreasonably, don't accept that, then there are so many different arguments for like whether it's become open policy. And so if it is open policy, then yes, we will go beyond what the policy limits are. Okay. When you're sending, so we kind of didn't discuss this. So going back to pre-litigation, are you sending the demand? Because oftentimes in pre-litigation, you're dealing with an insurance adjuster. So can you just explain during pre-litigation, are you sending it to the insurance adjuster? And then in litigation, are you now having to loop in the opposing side? Yes and yes. Okay. So in the beginning, if it's pre-litigation, a lot of the times an attorney is not, assigned for the other side. So yes, adjuster, sending it within the adjuster will send it. A lot of the times once you send a pre-litigation demand, maybe an attorney will be assigned to the case to assess it. But later on when we send it while we're in litigation, we do send it to the defense counsel. Okay, great. Yeah, and I think just a practice tip, once the defense attorney's aside, sometimes they haven't seen the initial demand letter. So I'll oftentimes resend it and I'll say this was sent on X date with all of these records attached, just so you're in the loop and you're fully aware, because sometimes they haven't been kept in the loop and they have no idea. So they're walking in blind. Yes. And that kind of along the same lines is like, I'll hop on a call and be like, hey, do you have everything? If you want to go through it, we can. I can tell you kind of where we're at in the case. Do you have the demand in front of you? Do you have these things? And if not, like I will send them to you. Absolutely. So I think we've done a good segment of just going over the basics of a demand letter. For our next segment, we'd love to incorporate more about how you can take that
and then make it very easy to paste into your mediation brief, and how it becomes another opportunity to storytell.
Exactly.
But that's our segment for today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and please tune in for next week's episode where we will touch on mediation.
Woo!